160 miles to the southwest of San Antonio, the external invasion component of PLA Group Armies 7 through 13 had smashed their way across the border and were now heavily active in the Laredo battle as they engaged the locally posted National Guard forces there to defend the border. As this well in excess of 350,000 strong external invasion prong bashed their way in, this was only one of 4 total such invasion prongs, as this external invasion prong was to move up I-35 at the southernmost point in Laredo and move deep inland into the nation as rapidly as possible in accordance with fourth generation warfare doctrine, as the purpose of the external forces in fourth generation warfare was in fact to serve as the heavy-handed reinforcements for the Trojan shock armies already deep inland, doing much of the proverbial heavy lifting, as it were, as these forces would move deep inland unopposed as the Trojans secured all of the key nodes, i.e. major cities and towns, all up and down the major invasion routes, as this would allow for the externals to move rapidly inland without having to stop whatsoever at all to engage any defending forces along the route, as the Trojans were already highly active in their various operations spanning the entire nation. I-35 was perhaps the single most important invasion route within the South Central invasion sector, which comprised predominantly Texas, but also New Mexico and Oklahoma as well. As these forces came from the most powerful nation on earth by far in terms of not only its sheer mass in terms of its population, but also the largest single industrial base on the face of the earth, which included defense industries, as well as also its gargantuan wealth, which matched its gargantuan economy in terms of its real size, which was by far the largest on earth, as were its forces under arms between its active, reserve, and ready reserve military forces, as well as its gargantuan paramilitary forces, which were even bigger than its regular military forces, which were already massive. China also had the largest aggregate of military hardware in storage for its reserve and ready reserve forces, as well as also its paramilitary forces, as not only did it have the largest defense industrial base on earth, but it was its own largest customer, as it literally had tens of millions of forces to equip, which was, in terms of scope and scale, an exceedingly tall order, but China managed to achieve this. Russia, also a tier 1 power, although definitely not China-sized, itself had a large industrial base in terms of its military industry as well, although again, not China-sized. It was larger than that of all of NATO combined, including the USA, as in the Great Eastern European proxy conflict, Russia massively outproduced the entire collective West in military hardware, as the Western model of war production was based on profit and not on purpose, putting it at a distinct disadvantage against nations like Russia, but especially China, whose industrial base was large beyond words. As we go to the map of the battle unfolding in San Antonio, the various forces on the map were all conducting their myriad of different operations, which likewise had a myriad of different purposes. Some operations served a dual purpose, which included some of the flank clearance operations, allowing for other forces located on the map to simply walk in and snatch major objectives like the infrastructure targets such as power plants and water and sewage treatment facilities and other such sites, including even the international airport, as one battalion of the 3 combat battalions of the 39th Engineering Regiment simply walked in and took it without incident, as the other major forces throughout the San Antonio battle space were occupied engaging in their various operations. By 1 a.m., the Lackland Air Base operation was about to wrap up, as was the battle unfolding at the Randolph Air Base, although the fighting in Camp Bullis would continue for another nearly 2 hours. At the same time, within the first hour of the invasion, a large grouping of refugees from neighborhoods surrounding the mall, known as the Ingram Mall, had fled to the mall trying to seek cover, but with them fled a grouping of armed reactionary civilians numbering over 300 in total size. They, in a rare act of mercy shown by the Russians, would be surgically eliminated in order to preserve the lives of the refugees as much as possible. As opposed to this, the other action that could have been taken was that the area could have been shelled into oblivion by very powerful Russian artillery forces, including the Howitzer Battalion of 2S-19 MSTA 152 mm self-propelled howitzers, which equipped the Howitzer Battalion of the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade. As all of the artillery forces of the 385th Guards Artillery Brigade were preoccupied with the battle occurring at Camp Bullis, as well as also wrapping up the Battle of Lackland, the howitzer battalions, having had fired on Lackland, would soon be diverted to fire on new targets, as the artillery of the Venezuelan 13th Infantry Brigade had already been shelling the Brooks Air Force Base, which was part of America's small but existent defense scientific industrial base, as high technology companies and DoD contractors and other firms had set up a consortium of their sites on the former Brooks Air Force Base, and it turned it into a defense industrial site as a whole, as many of these companies had DoD or DARPA connections. There were contracts. This was a major objective that needed to be destroyed by the coalition forces, and the Venezuelan 13th Infantry Brigade had been tasked out with this objective, although they would be supported again by Russian artillery. After finishing up at Lackland, the 2 howitzer battalions that had been firing on Lackland would be diverted instead to now fire on the Brooks Air Force Base once Lackland had concluded officially, as the Chinese missile forces across the border, the 612th and 613th Strategic Missile Forces Brigades, would also be firing long-range subsonic DH-10A cruise missiles at this site as well. These would be fired from the called-up reserve battalions that had bolstered the two brigades, making them reinforced brigades, as their number was larger than the ordinary battalions that comprise the active duty elements of these brigades, making them able to fire even more missiles than they would have if they were just the regular battalions comprising those brigades, as the called-up reserve battalions had been called up to fire widely mass-produced systems like the long-range cruise missiles, the DH-10As, as well as also older tactical ballistic missile systems that were still around in large numbers and kept in storage specifically earmarked for their use. As the flank clearance operation by 1 a.m. was also underway against the Ingram Mall. The mall had been seen by the local civilian population as a relatively safe haven, as it was a large concrete monolithic structure of sorts, as it appeared, and they thought that by heading into this site they would be relatively protected from all the combat unfolding all around them. However, they were sorely wrong, as all it would have taken was a determined artillery barrage or missile strikes or even airstrikes to level this entire area to the ground. But the Russians again opted to go in surgically to basically remove the armed reactionary civilian element, especially because they were near the 410 ring highway that surrounded the city, and also to clear the flanks as they were to proceed en route to the downtown area to secure a major highway junction in this area, especially I-35 and I-10, where they came together, as this was also in the downtown area. As they would clear the flanks en route, this would be very important for ease of logistics, for their own logistics, but any other forces passing through the area, and to effectively wipe out all threats in these different areas. And as a threat had arisen in the Ingram Mall, they were now en route to remove the threat. As we go to the map of the area of the Ingram Mall, it sits within a 1 mile east to west by 1 kilometer north to south area, and as shown, there are 3 different companies of mechanized infantry from the battalion operating in this area, as there were 6 mechanized infantry companies in the battalion, and there was a fire support or mortar company firing the 2S-12 heavy mortars, or the Sani mortars as they're called, which are massive 120 millimeter mortars, as well as also the headquarters and support company, which was the command and logistical elements over the whole battalion. The 3 companies sent in would be more than enough to conduct this operation, while the other 3 would be held in reserve and also have a secondary use of securing the flanks of their headquarters and support company, as well as also the fire support company of the battalion. As these 3 companies would move in, they had total ISR dominance, as always, as the Russians and Chinese had the greatest surveillance grid ever known, and it was connected to the Sino-Russian real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which crunched various domains and dimensions of data in milliseconds and updated data by the second on the combat data links, as well as advising the command elements on how to deploy and utilize their forces, all the way down to the tactical level, advising specific elements of these forces what types of munitions and weapons were safe to use and when, and the angle and traverse of weapons, as well as assisting in them coordinating their fires, all based upon where enemy positions were plotted by the second on the map. As they appeared and also as they were destroyed, they would be removed from the combat data links. As the friendly forces were also plotted on the combat data links, all forces knew where each other were at any given moment by the second, and were thus able to avoid friendly fire incidences in this way, as well as also the AI real-time battlefield data processing system advising each of these forces on what weapons were safe to use, as well as angle and traverse of their fire, allowing them to conduct maneuvers that were either very difficult in previous times of warfighting or were impossible in previous times, making the impossible possible, having revolutionized warfare. This technology is absolutely real, and China and Russia absolutely possess it, as China is the world's leader in AI, and Russia not very far behind, and they, having integrated their systems for the purposes of this invasion, had brought them, their surveillance apparatus, their AI and all their other technologies together to make the invasion all the more simplified. And also the AI could translate various languages between all the different coalition members, making communication seamless and immediate, instead of before, when this would have been far more difficult and time-consuming. As the various Russian forces were already busy tackling all the installations throughout the San Antonio area. This included Lackland, also the combat engineers from the 39th Engineering Regiment tackling the Randolph Air Force Base, while the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade handled Lackland and Camp Bullis. The very powerful 30th Motor Rifle Brigade forces were now cleaning up anything that remained on Camp Bullis, as the Armored Battalion, the only one within the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade, its very powerful T-72B3M main battle tanks, as well as its BMP-T Terminator anti-tank vehicles, which were very advanced and capable weapons, not just against armor, but also against infantry and light bunkers, as well as buildings, were mopping up anything remaining of the American Army forces from the Army National Guard that had been sent there, as the 81st Stryker Brigade Combat Team was the local unit posted to San Antonio to enhance security, although they would never receive orders to deploy to any of the various critical sites around the city, as the invasion had kicked off before this had become a reality. As again, America was very slow to mobilize its forces and resources, and as a result was taken completely off guard by this invasion. And even had they mobilized everything, they still wouldn't have been ready, as the invasion forces were simply of a gargantuan size, and their capabilities were seemingly limitless, as the technology, the weapons, the capabilities was simply all too much for the invaded party, i.e. the USA, to be able to contend with, as it was nowhere near ready for this scope and scale of warfare, as it had also, in the recent past, literally pissed away most of its resources on a proxy conflict with Russia it could scarcely afford to fight, as again, Russia far outpaced the entire collective West in arms manufacturing, and China was vastly larger than Russia and hadn't even had done anything until this invasion, so America really had no chance whatsoever at all in withstanding such an invasion, as the Spetsnaz forces would play a key role in the fighting in San Antonio. These very elite, highly capable forces were conducting expert operations in the Lackland and Camp Bullis battles, and would soon be conducting long-range reconnaissance patrol operations in Government Canyon to mop up any potential future partisan resistance forces trying to hide and operate out of the Edwards Plateau. As in the meantime, in the fighting that was unfolding in the Ingram Mall area, this was a very commercial area, highly commercialized, with the mall as the centerpiece and also many shops and stores surrounding the area. One company was moving in to turn and move to the slight east, with its weapons staggered, of course, as is standard operating procedure for single-column vehicle formations, to watch all avenues of approach as they would turn east, facing all directions, north, south, east, and west, while the second company would move in through the easternmost end of the parking lot and secure a sector of fire within this particular area, while the third company was to move and swing around the mall area to secure a sector of fire in the north, as well as also facing to the west. In the meantime, there were two platoons from this company on the very western end that had been deployed from their vehicles to clear these buildings before stopping at a concrete abutment filled with dirt and shrubs and trees for aesthetic reasons, of course, due to the mall, and were utilizing this as a firing position to fire at targets discovered in the parking area and on the roofs, as loitering munitions had also been deployed to support these forces by the headquarters platoons of each of these three companies, as well as also the headquarters and support company in overall command of the entire battalion, as it was also its main logistical force of the battalion. It also had a combat drone platoon within it, with 5 combat drone sections capable of firing 5 Lancet 3s apiece. So there were ample numbers of Lancet 3s airborne at the time of this attack, and also the fire support company with their heavy 120mm mortars, their 2S-12 mortars, were firing in support of their mechanized infantry forces, as the ISR quadcopter assets could radio in the exact coordinates of targets in the field, and thus mortars could be fired upon them accordingly, as well as also the loitering munitions on their AI target-seeking mode, slamming into targets, which was occurring instantaneously, as well as also there being 2 Russian combat drones operating in support of the ground forces. There was a larger Sirius combat drone, which had their Viker-1V missiles, and also a smaller Kronstadt Orion drone, which carried 4 air-to-ground munitions, which were equivalent in power to a 152 or perhaps a 155 shell, as a 152 and 155 are not all that different in terms of their overall destructive power. These would be dropped on forces fleeing out of the mall. As the Russian forces moving in from these 2 platoons, there would be 1 squad from this platoon that would be moving up, giving mutual support to their company's vehicles, while there was still 1 platoon that was mounted up in their vehicles, with the other 2 deployed to take the mall, with 1 squad moving up alongside of the vehicles, and another squad taking a position after these additional squads, 4 from each platoon out of the 5 each, moving towards the mall. 3 moving in this direction towards this department store, and 3 moving towards this department store, with 2 moving up the middle, bounding and covering, attacking all the targets in the parking lot in the center as they would get to this department store. As before they would even get into these stores, they were laying down enormous volumes of fire with the rolling T formation, an ideal formation for watching rooftops and higher floors of buildings, with the 2 point men on the end watching either side and the point man in the middle watching straight ahead. While this wedge formation was ideal for firing on 2 different sides, or even everyone firing ahead, or the point man firing ahead and firing on 2 different sides if needed, while these other squads temporarily took cover in these positions and laid down fire support on either side of these 2 advancing squads, as they were about to begin their bounds towards the building, as these 2 squads were already up and over the abutment and conducting their tactical bounding and covering while laying down heavy fire. Loitering munitions would come in and eliminate targets on the roof like so, as any targets that were on rooftops or high up ledges, as they had used the roof access to get up to positions like so, would be difficult targets to hit from the ground level for some of the dismounted forces or even the vehicle-based forces at times. Therefore, the loitering munitions on their AI target-seeking mode had rooftop forces as their highest priority, as well as also forces based in technicals like their pickup trucks or SUVs that they would actually be utilizing in this area. Although there were very few, comparatively speaking, in this battle, there were still some in use, like these coming out of the parking lot and down the street, that were being fired at by this MTLB from this company. By the time it was in this position, it was firing straight ahead its 12.7mm heavy DSHK machine gun. Loitering munitions struck this one at the opening. There were vehicles like this technical that were destroyed immediately as these vehicles were further back, and then as they were in this position, exchanging fire briefly with personnel in these vehicles, while these loitering munitions also came in to strike targets, including those trying to cross the street. As the artillery was coming in, it was mainly a terrain denial strike operation, except for avoiding the highway here. They were mostly striking to the southwest and west, and also to the general north of this area to prevent escapes, while they also did manage to also hit armed reactionary civilians with the heavy 152mm shelling, as by now it was an entire battalion effort from the Howitzer Battalion of the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade, as they had by now already long ago assisted their other units moving towards Camp Bullis in their flank clearance operations, as the Armor Battalion cleared this area of armed reactionary civilians. Combat engineers moving through this area briefly had an engagement, but most of these armed reactionary civilians immediately fled, which was a wise decision, while this group was destroyed by the mechanized infantry, and the shelling came in and also caused these to flee as well. They were now fully able to divert their attention to the Ingram Mall area, and thus the shelling was exceedingly heavy as all of the firing batteries of the battalion were able to assist in this battle, in this effort. And as these forces were moving through the parking area, their quadcopter assets were monitoring the whole battle space, as each and every vehicle crew / dismounted squad had their own quadcopters, so there were multiple of these quadcopters mapping the entire battle space in real time all over this entire area, able to see each and every individual out in the parking lot, and thus able to call in mortar strikes or assist in guiding the loitering munitions into their targets accordingly, as well as also the combat drones, as their operators would be able to easily find targets to destroy with their Vickers 1V missiles, as well as their airdropped 125-pounders on these targets moving this direction, including the technical, which annihilated that, as this Kronstadt Orion drone is doing such. And as the Sirius drone was an even larger and more capable attack drone, flying at a even higher altitude, it was firing its ATGMs down at these personnel that were fleeing the area, as well as also being struck by mortars, including those taking cover behind this abutment. Although not all would be wiped out, some would survive and remain to fire on this company when they would fully make it around. But they were moving gradually through the parking area, firing through vehicles, blasting many vehicles to scrap, as their heavy machine guns, as well as the weapons turret on the infantry fighting vehicles, the BMP-3s, were simply way too powerful in terms of their weaponry for simple automobiles to withstand, and thus they were being blasted and shredded to oblivion, as were many of the personnel trying to take cover behind them. Even the technicals that were actually in use at this time were also being struck by mortar strikes and annihilated, as well as being fired at by the ground vehicles as they gradually were moving through. These two half squads from one of the two dismounted combat platoons were bounding and covering tactically through the parking area, firing on any targets as their quadcopter assets sent the information back to their combat data links, which was instantaneous. As soon as these personnel were seen, they were fired upon and eliminated. As they were giving mutual support to their company's vehicles, these two half squads, acting as a full squad but in two half squad formations, were bounding through, giving mutual infantry dismount support to their vehicles and vice versa, with their vehicles giving them support as they moved through the parking lot and eliminated all the threats. As you can see in this imagery, this animation or illustration of the combat, some of the 100mm shells had taken chunks of the building material out of the walls of this building, as these were relatively powerful weapons, and one is sent sailing into the door entry area of this department store to blast these personnel into pieces. And of course, there were 30mm autocannons in the 7.62x54 coax, even ATGM pods, as these BMP-3s were very powerful weapons indeed, including also the heavy machine guns on the MTLB armor personnel carriers. Dismounts carried weapons like RPG-29 Vampires, as well as other RPG series weapons, as well as also their PKM general purpose machine guns, which were 7.62x54mm, and also light machine guns like the RPK-74, and of course the AK-74M, the standard rifle of the mechanized infantry forces, was utilized to great effect, as well as also some coming equipped with the 25mm tube for grenades to be fired, and those were utilized to great effect as well. As the combat illustrates, it was very heavy in the parking area, and of course, besides the loitering munitions, mortars were utilized, and again, the combat drones like this Kronstadt Orion, and of course the even larger, more capable Sirius attack drone, and of course there were Chinese combat air patrols, these two pairs of J-16 fighter jets, which the J-16 resembled very much the J-11, although it was a completely different aircraft with a shortened airframe, slightly shortened, and it was an even more advanced aircraft than the already highly capable J-11 was. The J-16 was a 4.5 generation aircraft, a bridge between 4th gen aircraft like this J-11 and also 5th gen aircraft like the stealth J-20 aircraft of the Chinese PLAAF, as they had their stealth fighter as the J-20. And the J-16 was, at this point in time of the J-16 squadron, they were all equipped with primarily air-to-air munitions, although they did carry a small host of air-to-ground munitions, limited to roughly 2 to 4 1,000-pounders each. And these aircraft, though they could be used in the close air support role, were not required, as the Russians had this situation completely under control. As these forces had cleared these buildings out, this squad broke into 2 half squads to go take position in this building to support these forces as they came around the corner of each side of the building and engaged these forces coming out of this building here before this half squad would go in and clear this store, and this other half squad of this full squad would take this corner as per standard building clearance procedures. This squad dismounting would actually take their corner here and engage these forces before peeling around, engaging these forces and going all the way around and getting these forces coming out of these buildings before this half squad even emerged. So there was no friendly fire, as again, everything was coordinated between the combat data links. This full squad would hold their position behind these stores, as there is of course more just off the map, and this half squad would hold their position here as well, with this half squad holding here, while the vehicles would go around this city block of shops and stores, again, to guard any escape routes, as these forces were doing effectively the same thing in their area. While this squad was coming around the corner here, they were coordinating all their actions with these squads. As this squad came to clear these buildings, this squad came up to clear this one took this corner and would hold their position, while this squad moved around and engaged these forces first, and then some of these forces around the side, while loitering munitions came in to hit the enemy forces on the roof to clear them off the rooftops, as again, those were high priority targets, as the other squad here was already taking fire at the opening from these technicals coming down the street, with this MTLB firing at them and shredding all of them to pieces with this loitering munition, destroying this one at the very opening. As the other vehicles were, as they were all moving around in this direction, other vehicles with their weapons staggered as they were all scanning their sectors of fire on either side, they would assist in finishing off these vehicles as they were moving at the same time they were moving. So the vehicles, as they moved around, lit these vehicles up and destroyed them. Then this squad peeled off when it was safe to do so and turned around the corner and assisted in engaging anybody that had survived that was coming out of these buildings, as some of these personnel were already outside and were lit up by the vehicle-based fires as the vehicles are coming around with their staggered weapons. These forces on the bottom here were already destroyed by the vehicle-based fires, and they lit these forces up. Then this squad here would come out and clear this building, while this squad would take position on the outside of it and take this corner, and they would coordinate that with this squad, who now was coming up and assisting in clearing these forces on this side of the building that had come out of it. And then they would both move on this building after these forces came out of this building and were lit up as a result. As this entire block had by now been cleared and these forces were destroyed, some of them would manage to escape in this direction, but they would be interdicted by these vehicles that had gone off the map to watch the escape routes. As all of that was happening at the opening, a mortar had fallen here, as well as a loitering munition. They were all equipped with fragmentation warheads, as those were the ideal warheads for dealing with dismounted infantry-like forces, as well as light-skinned vehicles, like civilian vehicles or light-skinned military vehicles that had no armor protection. So the loitering munition with the fragmentation warhead was the ideal choice, and thus these Lancet 3s were all equipped with such and had been utilized to great effect with the mortar strikes The combat drone strikes, which annihilated all these personnel emerging from the mall, going in 3 different directions, with the Kronstadt Orion destroying these forces, including this technical. These forces being hit by 4 Vickers 1V missiles, and the same was happening here with these forces going in this direction, as well as mortar strikes that eliminated them as well. These forces would be eliminated by another 120mm heavy mortar. The opening, these forces were all destroyed as they were on the outer blast radius of these blast icons, which indicate heavy shelling, which also drove these forces out of this concrete abutment filled with soil, shrubs, and trees, again for aesthetic reasons. And as they fled into this area, these forces were coming out of the buildings going into this area. These vehicles, after stopping and having engaged these forces in conjunction with the dismounted squads engaging these personnel in the parking area as well, like so, they now had pulled up to the end of this abutment here with these 2 squads conducting a double column rolling shield on the left side, peeling off and one going behind their other vehicle to the right, and engaging these forces at close range, including grenade range right over the abutment, using it as cover, including engaging these forces as they moved in this direction. They also had vehicle-based fires to assist them in this, as again, angle and traverse was very important as these forces took a knee or got in the prone position entirely, and the vehicle-based fire was firing right over them in a safe angle and traverse as they threw grenades over or fired 25mm grenades from the bottoms of some of the rifles of the men that possessed the grenade tubes of the 25mm grenades. Others fired over the ledge as they carefully raised their head just high enough to see over the edge and fired their rifles and light machine guns in accordance. And again, loitering munitions were used to great effect, as were the combat drones and the mortar strikes in this area as well. And then the vehicles turned the first lead platoon to face this direction while the other vehicles remained here as they pulled up. Now they had multiple sectors of fire, both facing the mall and facing all these directions, while this other company went to watch further afield off the map. This company, having had moved through this area, had eliminated all these forces using their quadcopter assets to effectively call in precision mortar strikes and also assist in the AI target-seeking mode of the loitering munition strikes. As on this embankment, as this was a highway exit, as these forces ran up towards the highway, a heavy mortar landed and finished them off, along with some of the loitering munition strikes. And as these forces got into position, these 2 half squads of the 2 original platoons that were dismounted in this area, these 2 half squads watched their sector of fire after assisting their vehicles in eliminating anybody that the loitering munitions and mortars didn't get. As then, after all this destruction had occurred in this part of the parking lot, the company in the far west of the mall parking lot would continue on engaging both personnel trying to leave the mall and others that were still in the parking area, destroying these technicals, these personnel in this area that didn't get hit by loitering munition strikes, before arriving here and having a very brief engagement with the few survivors that didn't get completely annihilated by this heavy mortar strike, and cutting them down as, again, there was 1 full platoon of mounted up dismounts that hadn't dismounted, as these 2 platoons had, from this company of combat forces as they left their headquarters platoon further back, which is their logistical and command elements. These 2 squads would dismount from the lead platoon and assist their vehicles in not just watching different sectors of fire, like towards the mall and away from the mall, but also help them finish off the last remaining stragglers that had survived the mortar strikes, missile strikes, and loitering munition strikes in that area. As loitering munitions had eliminated the personnel on the roofs, including those that tried to flee as soon as they saw what was going on and they got hit by one on their way out, these personnel on the ground level had, along with a little bit of loitering munition support, like one hitting this technical, and another one hitting these personnel on the roof. They had basically already finished off all the personnel, including this technical in the parking lot, using an RPG Vampire to destroy it before entering these department stores with 2 squads going in here, 3 going in this one, and 3 going in this one. As a total of 8 squads from the 2 platoons of 10, or 5 squads each, making a total of 10 squads, the 8 squads had gone in to clear the mall, and this would effectively be the longest part of the engagement, as between the personnel that were on the roof of the mall and those that remained still inside totaled a number of 70 personnel, as the combat on the outside of the mall was effectively in the process of wrapping up, if not completely having had concluded by this point, as there were very few survivors left on the outside, as for the most part, the vehicles and dismounted squads moving through the mall parking area had gotten virtually everybody, had eliminated surgically all of the opposition there. The forces moving inside of the mall had a entirely different operation ahead of them. They were now moving through relatively confined spaces in the form of the different stores that were on either side of the large mall corridor, as the corridor was relatively large, and a few squads even opted to operate their quadcopter assets in there. They were still a bit more exposed in terms of their quadcopter drones, as again they were operating in a more confined space, and they didn't have the freedom to rapidly move through the open skies, and it was entirely possible that some could be lost to hostile fire, at least inside the mall. But with the thousands of refugees taking refuge in the mall and the Russians opting to go in surgically to preserve as many of their lives as possible, sometimes it was not always possible to not only tell the difference between the non-combatants and combatants, but sometimes it was not always possible to completely save all the non-combatants, as some of them got in the way of the crossfire, while others would be eliminated by explosive weaponry, such as rocket-propelled grenade-type weapons, whether the RPG-29 or other RPG systems carried by some of the troops in a battle, whether by hand grenades, whether by the 25mm tube-fired grenades from beneath the rifles of the troops who carried those, as well as, again, the enormity of the crossfire in this area, as, again, this was a relatively confined space. And light machine guns, even general-purpose machine guns, as some of the squads had a man with a PKM, general-purpose machine gun, which was a larger 7.62 by 54mm machine gun, as it was a general-purpose machine gun, not a light machine gun, which the RPK-74 fired the smaller but high-velocity 5.45 by 39mm cartridge, like the AK-74M rifles did. The massive volume of all rifle fire, as well as general gunfire, was simply massive in this confined space, as well as the relatively liberal usage of some of the blasting types of weaponry possessed, whether, again, RPG-type weaponry or hand grenades, 25mm grenades. Although no ATGMs were utilized, like the Coronets or even Concors, in this area inside the mall, still, the firefights were on a gruesome scale. Although the tactical superiority of the Russians was evident as they moved on either side of the hallway, one squad on each side, slightly ahead of the squad moving up the center in a line formation. These other line formations would enter a shop on either side of the mall corridor. They would clear the store, and then as they would come out, the point man with all the other troops with their weapons staggered, covering all fields of fire, would tactically cover all their sectors of fire, while the point man would face diagonally on either side of the corridor in order to basically fire at anybody trying to hide behind corners, as each and every corridor had a department store at the very end. As the Russians were well aware of the floor plan involved in this massive building clearance operation, as this was a huge building to clear, they were fully aware that they had to watch not only the floor they were on, but also the bottom floor when they came across areas where there were openings, that the bottom floor was exposed, and they would use weaponry like hand grenades, and they would also fire down at personnel that they could see that were threatening them. And again, there were innocent bystanders, as in non-combatants, that were hit in the crossfire, but that was because they were amid some of the armed reactionary civilian combatants, like so, that were facing off against the Russian forces. Most of the time, the Russians were able to spare the lives of non-combatants and allow them to pass through unharmed, but again, it was not always possible to do so, as the combatants mixed with some of the non-combatants, making it very difficult to distinguish who was who and causing some non-combatant casualties. Although again, the Russians showed a lot of mercy in opting to do this surgically instead of simply razing this massive structure to the ground with a concerted artillery barrage or missile strikes or airstrikes. They opted to go in and offer the non-combatants the opportunity to live, while also dispatching the combatants and thus clearing the flanks for their next operations, as this had to be done because they could not allow guerrilla or partisan-like elements to threaten their flanks. As again, their logistical vehicles, command vehicles, and other light-skinned, vulnerable vehicles could not be threatened, and thus they had to eliminate any and all threats to their flanks, and thus they had to conduct these operations, whether they opted to use heavy firepower or go in surgically like they were doing in the mall battle. In this battle, they went in surgically, and although, again, they didn't have as many of their advantages like they would normally inside of the mall, they still opted to utilize their quadcopter assets in the open mall corridor areas, which did give them some benefits, although these were exposed to hostile fire within these confined quarters. But, again, it did offer them some benefits at least, and they were able to fly these further ahead of their operating squads as they moved down the corridor to see where any and all threats were. And as they were gradually mapped out on the combat data links, this also assisted them in knowing exactly where the threats were inside the building as much as all the threats were able to be seen outside, and thus they were able to coordinate their fires highly effectively, as these personnel around the corners were about to find out as the rounds were smacking ever nearer to them from these men firing diagonally as they finished clearing these stores, and these squads and line formations were coming out of these stores upon having had successfully cleared them, as well as troops that were further back, like in this line formation, firing an RPG-29, as another one had already been used here, and as warfare is ugly, limbs are being blasted in different directions, and of course 25mm grenades being fired, like one hitting this kiosk area, rounds smacking into this service desk, and of course there were signs and merchandise, and the floor plan inside the department stores themselves had escalators and stairs, and each and every hallway, each and every massive corridor, each and every small store on either side of the mall, each and every department store, food court, bathroom, closet, everything in this mall had to be cleared, and the Russians took 2 hours to completely and thoroughly clear the entire mall area, and were thus able to do so and do so effectively, as this squad moving up would hang slightly back while the two squads were slightly ahead of them on either side of the hallway. This squad would watch ahead, allowing for these squads to clear either side of the hallway, like so. As they would come out, they would diagonally face down with the point men facing diagonally down the hallway toward the department stores, while the rest would come out and man their sectors of fire. As they had full 360-degree security, they were able to watch behind these forces as they would come out of the stores. Plus, these forces would always have somebody watching the back, as their squad leader, not pictured here, was facing the back, as they had somebody watching behind them at all times, whether it was the two squads as they came out of the stores and their men in the rear of the squads watched behind them, or whether it was their squad leader or another soldier watching behind them. As they would allow non-combatants to pass, they had full 360-degree security, and there were 8 total squads moving through the mall area. So that meant that there was even another squad further behind this squad watching the back as well. And as they moved towards the department stores on either end, they had a slightly more difficult job than they did moving up the corridors and clearing the smaller stores, as these were larger stores, and again, there was a lot of merchandise in these stores that had to be basically carefully cleared, as there were more hiding spaces inside of the department stores than there were in these other stores that were much smaller, as well as in the corridors, and thus they had to be even more cautious when they went through these areas. The Russians would suffer several casualties as they cleared this large building. They would suffer 2 KIAs and they would suffer 5 WIAs, one that was serious, but for the most part, they, spending 2 hours clearing this mall, would succeed, as the movements outside leading up to the mall clearance on the inside would only take roughly 30 minutes, while the actions occurring inside, again, would take 2 full hours, as this had to be done meticulously and surgically in order to preserve as many non-combatant lives as possible. As again, they could have simply razed this building to the ground, but they opted not to do so, as can be seen outside, a loitering munition about to come down and hit this roof of the department store, as you can see through the skylight here. As outside, the combat was wrapping up as the squads had made it inside and had begun to move through the mall precisely and surgically with a very high degree of precision and tactical superiority, as these squads covered all their sectors of fire, 360-degree security, and moved through surgically, clearing this large structure. As the mall battle wrapped up, the Russian forces would be moving on after a brief logistical pause and resupply and replenishment for the 3 companies that partook in this operation, as the troops would have to stop and eat, as they required sustenance as well, as these operations were very touch and go, very fast. The tempo was very high, and the forces worked up their appetite as they had to conduct very physically demanding operations which burned calories, so they had to eat. They also had to conduct any needed maintenance, although there was none needing to be conducted. The vehicles were operating in perfect shape, so they also had to refuel, though, but they also had to rearm as well, with any spent ammunition being replenished. And after all of this was done within a span of about 30 minutes, they would rapidly move on to their next flank clearance operation, as artillery had already, by the end of this operation, begun to shift fire to pound the north-central part of San Antonio, as an armed reactionary group of civilians were seen clustering together in this area, as again, the communications down had caused this to happen, as this is exactly what would happen in a comms down situation, as groupings of armed civilians would find one another and band together like so, and they were spotted by the ISR assets, both high altitude and the quadcopter assets, as these forces gradually approached,